folks. We're right at 2 o'clock here, and I'm going to give it just like a few more seconds to let attendees trickle in. But I will start with giving a short intro. Folks will hear everything they need to hear for the webinar. So welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Emily Knight. I am Senior Manager with the Lenfest Ocean Program. For those that don't know us, the Lenfest Ocean Program is a grant-making program that funds ocean and coastal research projects and expert working groups to address needs facing decision makers and communities. You can learn more about us and the projects we fund at lenfestocean.org. And on that, my colleague Kayla Ripple will drop resources and links into the chat as we go throughout this webinar. While you're there, you can also sign up for our newsletter. This webinar is part of the Lenfest Climate Resilient Fisheries webinar series, which has been occurring monthly for the bulk of this year. The next installment will be on the role of habitat and life history in climate vulnerability of fisheries, and that will be on January 22nd, 2025. So please join us, and Kayla will share the registration link for that. But today we are featuring project work on managing for adaptive capacity in climate-ready fisheries. And some of our speakers are Dr. Jim Sanchirico of UC Davis, Dr. Matt Reimer, also of UC Davis, and Monica LaFleur of Ocean Science Trust. I also want to acknowledge that joining us is Anthony Rogers, formerly with Ocean Science Trust, and now with Ocean Conservancy, but he has been a critical thought leader on the development and implementation of this work. So he will be available to answer any questions that are relevant to him. The project has been ongoing since 2020, so we have a lot to talk about. So before I get started, I want to share just a few webinar logistics. With so many people, in attendance, we have all attendees muted to prevent feedback or echoes. We will hold Q&A with the speakers at the end, so please type your questions at any time during the webinar into the Q&A panel. You're seeing my colleague Kayla put links in the chat. Feel free to share any resources in the chat or introduce yourself or offer any comments. If possible, keep your questions to the panel in the Q&A panel just so we can keep track of the queue, but we will check the chat and do the best we can. We may not get to everybody's questions, but you are always welcome to follow up with us at Lenfest or the research team. And finally, we are recording this webinar and we'll distribute the link broadly afterwards. So with that, I will hand it over to Jim Sanchirico. Jim?
Great. Thank you very much. I wanted this at the outset here, thank the Lenfest Ocean Program for all their support over all the years. And I think I first probably should address the title. It is not as advertised, and really that is because our thinking has evolved significantly over the 3+ years on this project, and that's largely due to the many different engagements we've had with managers and fishers over the course of the grant that Matt and I really wanted to call out Ocean Science Trust, Monica and Anthony for helping with that and really helping us engage with the community over the last 3 years. And I think what you're going to see is our research project has expanded beyond just thinking about flexibility and permits. The other thing before sort of jumping in, it's hard being located in California to give a talk right now on sort of commercial fishery management without acknowledging really the pain and hardships that the commercial fishing industry has been facing over the last 10 years in California. Just came out again this week that crab is delayed again for whale entanglements on top of salmon closures, on top of all the other things that have been happening, the HAB events, the warm blobs, et cetera, off the shores of California. And so we want to acknowledge all that. And I think in doing so, it really sort of frames what we hope to achieve with our research, which is really thinking about mechanisms that could be developed that try to help communities and fishers respond to the certain crises that seem to be happening at much more frequent timescales or frequent occurrences than we originally thought, at least 10, 15 years ago. So that just in terms of logistics, I'm going to hand over to Monica a little bit just to talk a little bit about Ocean Science Trust. I'll come back and then Matt's going to come at the end, clean up all my mess and give you all the sort of key sort of take home points and also touch this to some other work that we're doing that's sort of related. And I'm in charge of slides. So let's see if it all works.
You can stay on that one for me for a second, Jim.
Okay.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining today and echoing Jim's shout out to Lenfest team for hosting this and for all of your support throughout the project so far. It's been great to work with you all. So my name is Monica LaFleur. I am a science officer at Ocean Science Trust. And a little bit about OST. We are a 501c3 nonprofit created by the California legislature back in 2000 to help bridge the gap between scientific research and sound ocean management. So we take a coordinated, multidisciplinary, and multi-institutional approach to use science to accelerate progress toward a healthy and productive ocean and coast. And this is exactly what we've done our best to do through this partnership with UC Davis, which is connecting this research to management and industry challenges and questions. So as Emily mentioned, we're also joined by my colleague, Anthony Rogers, who has been partnering on this project since its inception. And he recently started his new position with Ocean Conservancy. And we're happy for him and also very sad and miss him already. But super glad that he can be here with us today to join the discussion at the end of the webinar and answer any additional questions about the context for this research. So before Jim and Matt share about research to date on the project, I wanted to provide a little bit of background about how it came to be. And so now you can go to the next one, Jim. So OST has been engaged in conversations and research on readying California fisheries and fishing communities for climate change for nearly a decade now. And in 2019, we hosted an in-person workshop in partnership with a few California state agencies, including the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Fish and Game Commission, and the Ocean Protection Council, focused on exploring management and policy options that the state has the ability to use to address climate change and impacts to California fisheries and fishing communities. So the workshop brought together a pretty diverse group of researchers, nonprofits, fishermen, resource managers, both from inside and outside of California. So, and they discussed challenges under climate change for California fisheries. So this list is just a very non-exhaustive short list of some of the things that were brought up at that workshop. So you'll see a lot of familiar challenges to this group, I'm sure. So range shifts, understanding where fisheries are going to shift under climate change futures, fishery closures, like Jim mentioned, some of the disasters that have been happening along the West Coast that have increased in frequency and scale over the last few years, infrastructure impacts from sea level rise and coastal inundation, as well as non-marine impacts like fires and coastal disasters. So across all these challenges, one of the cross-cutting issues is exacerbated uncertainty in the magnitude of impacts. And so all of these challenges were discussed, and as were a couple of solutions that the folks at the workshop wanted to explore more. So some of those included community-owned fishing opportunities, cultivating emerging and new opportunities like aquaculture or emerging fisheries as we experience those range shifts, potential insurance schemes to support fisheries communities, and permitting. But in order to explore whether any of those solutions may actually be useful in building adaptive capacity for California fishers and fishing communities under climate change, you need to understand current adaptive capacity and potential margins for increasing that adaptive capacity. So that's where this research project comes in. And with that, I will turn it back to Jim, I believe.
Great. Thank you. So just to give you a sense of where we're headed, I'll sort of set the stage, then sort of talk about this idea of a fishery definition or permit definition. And that's really the core of how that fishery is defined. And then that then leads us to think about how do we think about adaptive capacity within that definition. I'll come back to this a couple times, but partly what we're doing here is trying to set up a framework for how to think about adjustments you could make for commercial fisheries management under this idea of short-run climate shocks that are occurring. So we'll talk about sort of internal and external margins conditional on that definition of a fishery. I'll give you some ideas or examples of how to apply the framework using California. I'll pass off this time sort of Matt to talk about sort of discussion, next steps, thinking about, and also sort of the ongoing work that we're doing. One thing I also want to mention is on the right of the screen there, that is the cover of the working paper where many of the ideas that we're talking about today can be found. It's at Resources for the Futures website, and it's available to be downloaded. And the link, thank you very much, just got put in the chat. So I'm sure this audience doesn't need me to talk about all the different changes that are occurring in the oceans, and the frequency has also sort of changed and seems to be more frequent over the last 10 to 15 years. And as I said in the introduction, I think 25 years ago, we thought that these things were going to happen, but they were going to happen so far out in the future that they weren't part of the conversation. And I think we all now realize that things are changing faster, and it's now a good time to start thinking about how we can introduce adaptive capacity. So here's just sort of different figures highlighting what's been going on with regards to sort of marine heat waves, or the blob as it was called, off of California. Across different periods of time, these heat waves are occurring in other places. Of course, fisheries have always been subject, especially here on the West Coast, to decadal oscillations or El Nino, La Nina sort of cycles. And that's leading to observations that species are moving temporarily, their ranges are shifting, and there could also be more permanent shifts occurring. And you can see pictures on the slide of the sort of black sea bass on the East Coast, and also changes in distribution of Pacific cod up here in Alaska. And the literature has responded about trying to think about all the different occurrences that are happening around the world. So, you see titles in the literature about tipping points in the cod fishery, communities are at risk, how do we adapt, what is happening now, shifting habitats, expose risk to climate change. So there's a lot of conversations about how do we think about moving commercial fisheries management from where we are today, maybe to a new place that could better handle all of these things that are occurring. I'm going to stop looking at the chat. So in that framework, people have talked about this idea of climate-ready fishery management. And so let me just sort of quickly sort of take a definition. And this is really coming from the paper by Jono and others that was published a number of years ago, but thinking about it as a sort of proactive way of responding or adapting to the impacts of climate change. And that goes through all of fishery management, from data collection, accounting for these issues, and climate stock assessments. But as you can see in that second bullet, also thinking about more responsive decision-making, whether it be and flexible permitting systems, and ideas of sort of dynamic spatial management. And these ideas are out there. They've been discussed in the literature, all those sort of papers that I highlighted on the last slide. And they all make an important contribution, but what I think we found as a research team was that it was hard to sort of parse what they all were saying and what that actually meant in an implementation sense. And that's really where our sort of framework came from. And thinking about this issue of short-run shocks that are occurring, what does that mean? How can fishers adapt? Well, you're thinking about managing risk across the entire sort of fishery system. And there are lots of different dimensions over which this could occur. It is a function of the fishery regulations, the governance regime. So that is, how are we managing these fisheries? Is it a regulated open access, or a limited entry, a regulated access fishery, or catch share? Fishermen are making decisions based on what they expected catch rates in particular locations at times. they're responding to things that happen out in global markets or exchange rates, like fish prices or fuel prices. There's impacts of, how we think about crew availability and compensation, really thinking about this idea that, season delays don't just affect the vessel owners, they affect the crew. Maybe the crew was all ready to go when the season was supposed to open, and now what do they do for a month or two while that season's delayed? And thinking about what the crew availability and that compensation. Of course, all these short-run decisions on how things are changing are impacted by contracts fishers have with processors or processor capacity, decaying port infrastructure that we hear a lot about here on the West Coast, and fisher demographics and their experiences. Have they weathered different kinds of these shocks, warm blobs, marine heat waves, for example, and given that experience, how do they respond? And then, of course, it also depends on their vessel configuration. How much hold or fuel capacity? What's the size of the vessel? Is it made for particular gears? How much do they have freezing technology on board? And of course, sort of weather is another thing that's sort of driving sort of short-run decision-making on fishing, which is really how we want to cast this whole discussion about sort of adaptive capacity in sort of climate-ready fishery management. And for the most part, the literature that I sort of mentioned quickly before has focused on this idea of diversification. That is, fishermen can adapt by holding multiple permits or landing different fish. And that's great. And we agree with that. But we think that that has narrowed the conversation a little too much when thinking about how to design adaptive fishery systems for the climate changes and these short-run shocks. So our research question is thinking about, so are there mechanisms that managers can implement to sort of improve adaptive capacity of both fishers and then fishing communities to these sort of short-run extreme events that at the same time don't jeopardize the sort of long-run sustainability of the ocean ecosystem, right? And we're going to think about how we got to their current conditions to really understand those trade-offs. And I think Matt will come back and talk a little bit about that. Well, on the one hand, we're sort of optimistic, right? In terms of our ability to do this, because fishing is and has always been a very risky enterprise. It's not agriculture, it's not plant your crops and you get back, especially here in irrigated agriculture on the West. And so the ability to adapt, these fishermen have been evolving and changing their business models under all these changing conditions for long periods of time. And that gives us optimism that there's some ability here for the system to respond to these extreme events. On the other hand, there's a little bit of pessimism because a lot of the evolution of conventional fishery management, especially here in the US, has probably evolved over what was relatively a stable period of the ocean ecosystem, and has sort of been, the basis of it has been this idea that the system, the underlying environmental conditions, climate conditions, were relatively stationary, subject to sort of, like I said, decadal oscillations or El Nino, La Nina. And then the second question that we address is thinking about those other mechanisms, similar to what that literature are, is diverse portfolios. Is that something also considering ideas of risk pools or harvesting cooperatives as other ways that we can think about designing adaptive systems? And that sort of first question is really sort of a top-down kind of question from a regulatory or manager perspective, where this sort of second question is really sort of bottom-up. What are the sort of ability of the fishers themselves to sort of respond and adapt? And of course, they are related and connected through regulations and the governance. So thinking about these questions, it's important to understand the evolution of sort of how we got to where we are. And hopefully you'll agree at the end that there's more substance than style to this figure. This was hand drawn on my tablet, so hopefully it all works. But basically, we've gone through a general evolution of fishery management. On the bottom there, we started out under open access. We understood that that led to stocks being overfished. There really wasn't any economic or long-run gains. But at the same time, we might have said that that's the most adaptive system there is. Fishermen have free entry in and out. Anybody can come in and out of the fishery. And so it's important to sort of think about that. But then, of course, in response to that stocks being overfished, we introduce regulations. We call that typically a regulated open access. Maybe that's introduced closed seasons or gear restrictions or vessel size restrictions. Again, relatively adaptive because fishermen are relatively able to move back and forth across fisheries and respond. But again, evidence and the literature has shown that it also led to sort of ecological waste and sort of forcing fishermen in these competitions to catch as many fish to sort of push up their costs to their revenues and really no economic gains. In response to that, the sort of regulated open access world, we started restricting the access or limited entry sort of programs. And that essentially, as the literature has pointed out, is maybe less adaptive in the sense that fishermen now must own a permit to go in and out, and those permits are limited. They might take on values. But at the same time, we also have evidence that began to improve sort of the economic conditions of operating in the fishery, at least if you held those permits. And finally, in some places, there's been evolution to sort of a catch share system, where again, we see sort of economic and ecological gains, but barriers through adaptation. The literature has sort of discussed this, that, you know, through time, as we restricted access and permits and now quotas and catch share programs, that adaptive capacity might have gone down overall in the system. The other thing that's important to point out is that the movement into restricted access is really when we started institutionalizing the definition of what a fishery is or a permit as we limited them. And that's really important to think about how now we can introduce the adaptive capacity into a system that is more towards restricted access and catch share, at least in the US. And like I said, some places like California, in our state fishery, we basically stopped at restricted access programs. But, you know, lots of federal fisheries are in sort of the catch share system right now. So when you think about the different definitions to introduce adaptive capacity about, you know, how do we define permits, we focus in on sort of 4 dimensions: the species that that permit applies, the gear or sector, as it's called sometimes, that you can that permit allows, the time, the season that you can fish it, and then the area, the location. And adaptive capacity is going to depend on those 4 dimensions. Like where can we introduce adaptive capacity into the system? And the sort of on this sort of drawing, the most restrictive is sort of the center. That is where a permit is defined for a single species over a short season within the year. 1 gear is allowed and only can be utilized in 1 area, right? And then we can expand and think about how we go from that most restrictive to potentially least restrictive permits and quotas in a system. And one might imagine that you could represent that as if you were out at sort of the boundary of this space. So that is, you know, what we're connecting here with these lines, where you might be able to use your permit across multiple areas. Maybe the permit is for a basket of species, so it allows you to fish multiple species. Maybe it allows multiple gears. It's not tied to a fixed gear or trawl or a pot, for example. And it could also be tied to giving you access across seasons, and so across time or across multiple periods of time within a given year. And so you could think about on this sort of framework how you'd have that sort of least restrictive. And what we're going to do is we're going to come back in that California fishery example, and we're sort of map different fisheries onto this sort of permit dimensional space. All right, so given you have a permit, you've defined it, you've institutionalized it through a restricted access program, what are the different mechanisms by which you could think about introducing adaptation conditional on that definition? And the way we're thinking about this is breaking it up into what we call an internal margin and the other one being the external margin. And the internal margin are adaptations within the permitted fishery definition. So that could be lengthening the season, could be opening closed areas temporarily, it could be changing size restrictions, could be allowing different gears, but it's all within the permitted fishery definition. And the other one is the external margin, and those are adaptations beyond the permitted definition. So maybe I can use a permit for species X to go fish in another area for species X. Maybe I can use my quota in one species to fish for another species, right? That's where the margin is beyond the definition of that permit or quota that we're thinking about. And typically the literature, as I mentioned, has focused in on the external margin. That is, can I make my permit flexible so I can go fish if the rain shifts? I could then take my permit and use it somewhere else, right? Would be an external margin adaptation. And one of the reasons why we adopted this framework was that we think the conversation needs to be expanded beyond just that. And this is really that evolution of our thought that has occurred. And that is that we should be thinking about how we can design adaptations in the short run within a permitted fishery definition, and not just this idea of having adaptations beyond or across permits. So another way to depict this is, you could think about, you have for a species here, let's call, we have a blue species, and you could tell that an economist is running that our species are blue, or they're X or Y, and they're not really named, but I do have pictures of fish in a little bit, I promise. So you could think about all the different regulations that we use that are within that permit. So we can talk about input kind of restrictions like closed areas or season or gear or vessel, or it could be on the output, the trip catch limits, size restrictions, etc. And that's all within the permit definition that is defined by species, area, gear, and time. So on the internal margin, we could be thinking about adjusting on a short run basis any of these different sort of tools or rules that we have available. The external margin would be moving within a region from one species to the next, or one permit to the next, and that's represented here by the green being another species. But we could also think about external margin being from one area to the next. So allowing permit as defined in area 1 being allowed to be used in area 2, for example, is another example of external margin. So one of the things we did in this project is we went around and looked around the world at all the different kinds of adaptation measures across internal and external margins that already exist out there, that people are using, or managers are using around the world, right? So we could try to devise all these new tools, but we also wanted to say, look, key point here is managers have been incredibly innovative around the world to address the issues that shock or that species has required. And there's a lot of tools out here that we can talk about that have experience, that we have data, and we could assess how they've worked or not to see, in any particular location, how well would it map into. And the other thing I want to point out about this slide, I'm going to talk about some of the details on it, is, when we talk about climate-ready fishery systems and management, people throw around ideas of dynamic spatial management. And the question is, well, what does that actually mean? Or flexible permits, as we had in our title, what does that mean? And by breaking it down in terms of this internal margin, external margin, and then across the 4 dimensions, we can get a lot more context in how we might implement dynamic spatial management. So on the internal margin, it could be opening up areas that are currently closed. It could be expanding boundaries. It could be opening up times or seasons that typically are closed. You could think about reallocating catch limits across gears or across quota areas. So for example, summer flounder on the East Coast is an example where the states get allocated quota, and the states can actually trade quota amongst them. Different states can purchase or trade with other states to get some of that quota, right? That would be across the external margin idea. In terms of flexible permits, we could think about, well, it depends on how the fishery is managed. If it's an individual quota program, so down here, it could be that we have a trap leasing program, right? And we do that in the spiny lobster fishery in Florida. There are other examples around the world in Australia. We could also think about species quota conversions. It's a tool that Iceland uses, right? It's an external margin where I could trade quota in cod and convert it into some other species, Greenland turbot, for example, right? That's an example, an external margin where you can be able to convert across. That would be an example of the flexible permits. You could think about banking and borrowing provisions. If you had an ITQ or an IFQ program, for example, where fishers are allowed to bank some quota across years or borrow on future allocations, that's a way of introducing flexibility to the quota permit definition that could introduce adaptive capacity. The other thing that I want to sort of point out, and the paper goes into a lot more of these different details, is that the management context matters, right? The set of tools available are conditional on how we manage the fishery, whether it be a limited entry or input quota or an output quota type of program. And I think that's really important when we try to take these ideas of climate-ready fishery management and implement them in different places. So we could take some of these ideas back to this 4 dimensions and say, okay, across the internal margin, one way to introduce adaptive capacity would be to allow banking and borrowing, right? And that's across the time dimension. Across the area dimension of a permit, we could open up areas temporarily, right? And we where you have areas that have been closed for many years, but maybe in a particular year, given a current environmental condition, whether it be warm water or some other factor, could lead to it being opened. You could think about across gear, you could think about that tradable inputs or pots as an example of how you might allow some degree of adaptation along the sector gear. In terms of the external margin, well, species conversions, one way to expand it on the sort of species or multiple species dimension. You could, across the area, you could access other areas, the example I used earlier, or you could allow potentially gear switching. So that's an example here from like the West Coast groundfish, where the quota was allocated to trawlers, but they're allowed to switch over to fixed gear, right? And fixed gear sector can also buy some of the trawl quota. So that's allowing gear switching potentially within the system, which could give the fishermen, the quota owners, a lot more flexibility depending on where the fish are in a given year, for example. Okay. So moving into the California fisheries, and we're sort of map them onto that system. A couple of things I want to do before getting into the details. One, just this first graph on the left is just showing you revenues of fish that are caught in California, landed in California. You can see through time it's sort of gone up and down, oscillated. The number, the different species in the mix has also sort of changed through time. The middle schematic here is just, I wanted to call out the great report that OST did back in 2017, really just highlighting the heterogeneity in fisheries across California and the importance of taking that into account when thinking about climate-ready fisheries. And then lastly, just the last one just sort of highlights sort of the major port regions within California that sort of correspond to different species ranges within the state. And like I said, I do have pictures of fish. So the 4 examples we're going to use are sort of California halibut, nearshore finfish or rockfish, which is quite a complicated fishery. We're also going to look at the market squid and the sort of spot prawn fishery. These case studies or examples were chosen really just to highlight different dimensions of how the permit is defined and where it falls in our sort of framework we have no idea that these fisheries are more or less likely dealing with issues associated with short run shocks. It's really just about highlighting certain points of the framework. So halibut is managed as a single species. The permit, it's only permitted in a trawl zone, which is quite narrow, 1 to 3 nautical mile band. So these are mainly, I'm focusing on the state fisheries here. That band occurs in the sort of south central off of Santa Barbara area. It only allows 1 gear by regulation. Only light touch trawl gear is permitted in the fishery. Has no carryover or borrowing. There is transferability of the permit that can go to a vessel of equal or lesser capacity. So if I was mapping halibut onto our system, they would sort of fall into this example of sort of most restrictive, right, across all 4 of those different dimensions, which of course then opens the question, how is there ways that we could introduce adaptive capacity in here that doesn't potentially impact the sustainability or conservation goals. In terms of near for finfish or rockfish, it's a species basket. There are 19 sort of fish within it. It does overlap with the federal groundfish management. In California, it's a hook and line fishery, both off of shallow and deep water. Those permits are defined. There's no conversion between the two. There are 4 regions within California that those permits are defined for, and there is an ability to trade one permit for another, but it has to be at a 2-to-1 sort of ratio. There's no temporary conversion, no across regions or depths permitted. There are some trip limits for different species within that basket. There is really just 1 gear sector that sort of dominates the hook and line. There is a trap endorsement, but it's pretty small overall. And again, there's sort of no carryover or thinking about 1 year to the next. And so on our system, we represent that, across the species dimension, the idea of a species basket does introduce ideas that there are some flexibility across the species dimension. The area, the ability to convert, or maybe that area that is no longer able, someone might have just said in the chat, that's fine, the rules changed, so maybe that conversion has gone away, would potentially allow some expansion along the area. And then the idea of the sort of multiple gears allowing to be caught is another potential area of adaptation. In terms of the spot prawn fishery, that's California wide, but mainly caught in Southern California, where they're mainly located, the fishery. It is a 1 gear sector. Trawl were banned in 2003. It's a trap fishery. It has different permits by tiers. Tier 1, there's transferable within that tier. Tier 2 is associated with a trap limit and a pound limit per season. It's not transferable. And then Tier 3 was a category that was created for trawlers to enter into the trap permit fishery if they wanted to. And so again, we can map that in. It's a little bit more flexible in the area because it's not tied to a particular region. It's California wide, granted, depending on where the spot prawns are located. Market squid, again, California fishery wide, even though most of the landings are south of Monterey. It does allow 2 gears, light boats and braille. You can trade permits 1-to-1 between the two. There is some permit transferability on the capacity side and also entry needs, but you can see how it sort of maps again across those 4 dimensions. And as a way of sort of starting the conversation of how we might introduce adaptive capacity in this particular context. All right, Matt, you can take over.
Yep, sounds good. Hi, everyone. Matt Reimer. So Jim has touched on a lot of different options here today for fishery managers. And if it hasn't become apparent yet, the appropriateness of any one option is obviously going to be very context specific. So there's not going to be any one size fits all approach that will help all fishers. The margins that are going to be available are going to depend on the management context, the stocks that are being managed, the types of shocks that fishers and fishing communities are susceptible to. And so any sort of action that's taken to promote adaptive capacity has to consider the specific context at hand and any potential trade-offs associated with such actions, some of which I'll talk to in a few minutes here. So similarly, the policymakers and the options that they have available to them are going to depend on the definition of a permit. And so, for example, the examples that Jim just walked through for California state fisheries, banking or borrowing quotas across years aren't available for those fisheries because they're not managed with output quotas or a total allowable catch. And it may be the case that some permit definitions are more conducive to adaptability than others within a specific context. And so it might be that in the long run, managers want to consider changing the definition of a permit or the rules that govern a fishery so that it aligns more appropriately with adaptability measures for that context. And again, appropriateness here is going to be very context specific. And so, some of the other options that we've been thinking about in this project that are not related or different and distinct from some of the more top-down options that Jim has been talking about are so-called bottom-up options, where essentially fishers and fishing communities are enabled to organize themselves to promote adaptive capacity that is outside of the definition of any given permit. And we think that these are really important to consider because while there are a lot of tools we believe that managers have at their fingertips already, they're not going to be able to address all sources of risk and exposure for fishers and fishing communities. And some of these might be better addressed through a bottom-up approach. So for instance, harvesting cooperatives, where fishers are collectively kind of come together to organize a fishery of a shared annual catch allocation, can be very advantageous because it takes advantage of the collective knowledge and real-time information of the members in that cooperative. And there's several examples of harvesting cooperatives in the United States. In Alaska and the West Coast, we have the American Fisheries Act, Pollock Cooperative, we have the US West Coast Pacific Whiting Cooperative. And there's actually several examples in which these cooperatives have actually instituted some of the internal margins that Jim already talked about today. For example, time and area closures for bycatch-related reasons. There's also permit and quota banks, and these entities will often own a collection of fishing rights to lease out to fishers, which can be important for addressing adaptive capacity by relieving some of the financial burdens for acquiring permits or quotas in other fisheries, which tend to be quite expensive and are a prominent reason for which we see kind of a decline in the number of fisheries and the number of permits that people or fishermen own. So on the West Coast, we have the Monterey Bay Fisheries Trust that owns and leases quotas for the U.S. West Coast groundfish fishery to local fishers. And there's other examples in the U.S. and other countries as well. And then there's risk pools. So risk pools basically are fishers pooling together permits from multiple fisheries and manage the derived benefits of those collectively. And these can be really useful for facilitating the transfer of permits between members or redistributing quotas, for instance, in a multi-species fishery context where there is issues with balancing quota holdings with on-the-water catch compositions, for instance. And for risk pools that operate by redistributing proceeds at the end of a season according to some allocation rule, these can be very useful for reducing the risk of short-run shocks. And of course, these approaches aren't without their own challenges. It's very well known that many of these examples come up across against collective action problems like moral hazard and adverse selection. And so, again, these are really only beneficial to the extent that such collective action problems can be addressed. Jim, do you want to go to the next slide? Thanks. So as Jim mentioned earlier in his presentation, an often discussed strategy for promoting adaptive capacity is diversified portfolios of fishing permits. And again, the idea here is akin to a diversified portfolio of financial assets that are spread across different asset classes. So basically to reduce volatility and risk exposure. And there's a very large literature that has demonstrated that diversified portfolios reduce volatility for both individual fishers and community fishing returns. And this has often been promoted as a important strategy for adaptive capacity, but it doesn't come without its own costs as well and its own challenges. And in fact, what we've seen over time is fisheries diversification is decreasing. And partly this is due to increasing barriers to participating in multiple fisheries. And so what I've given here as an example are a couple of figures that come from the Dungeness crab vessels in the northern part of California. And on the right here are what we call participation networks for both 1994 and 2019. And in these figures, the blue dots represent nodes or fisheries, and the size of those nodes represent the number of vessels that are participating in those fisheries. And again, for these are all conditional on participating in Dungeness crab. And then the edges and the thickness of them are basically representing the number of vessels that jointly participate in these other fisheries. And it's pretty obvious when you compare 1994 to 2019 that the size of the network has decreased significantly, as has, in fact, the number of vessels that are participating. And really what we see is a movement from a somewhat diversified and connected network in 1994 to one that is very concentrated on just a couple of fisheries, particularly salmon and Dungeness crab. And, as we've seen over the last few years, those two fisheries have been subject to a lot of, hardships and some pretty large shocks that have, occurred in both of these fisheries simultaneously. And what you can see on the left is a figure of fisheries diversification based on the revenue that comes from different fisheries. And again, this is for the Dungeness crab boats in the northern part of California. And the y-axis is measuring what we call a Shannon diversity index, which is basically measuring the effective number of fisheries from which revenue is coming from. And what you can see here is I've plotted the 25th and 75th percentiles along with the median and the average. And essentially what this shows is that over time, the diversity of revenues coming from different fisheries has decreased quite significantly in this area. And this is true for other areas throughout the world. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do in our work that we're not really going to speak too much about today is trying to understand how and why these permit portfolios have evolved the way that they have and what their role in mediating environmental and regulatory shocks is. And, one of the things that has kind of stood out to us is that it's not clear how to implement a strategy for increasing diversification of fishery portfolios. One of the reasons is because the barriers to entry into these fisheries have come along with the introduction of limited entry programs, which has pushed up the cost of permit prices that have to be purchased to participate in these fisheries. And any sort of measure that might lower those barriers to entry into other fisheries are very quickly likely to come up against political economy issues with respect to people who already own those permits and their investments that they've made into those fisheries. And another issue that could come about if you were to reduce some of the barriers to entry into some of these fisheries is that the value of a fishery and the price reflected in a permit also reflects the health of a fish stock. And so we might be worried that measures that reduce barriers to entry could also compromise incentives to preserve the health of the fishery and a fish stock if that's not captured in the value of that asset. Another thing that we've seen with diversification that has been a little bit problematic is that diversification is good if you have low correlation across fishery returns. But what we've seen in recent years is that shocks are actually occurring to multiple fisheries all at once. And that's been particularly true in California and the West Coast with salmon and crab fisheries, which have also tended to correspond with declines in prices for other stocks that are important for portfolios in the West Coast, such as sablefish. And so, again, These are really important questions, we think, about the role of fisheries diversification in promoting adaptive capacity. Jim, next slide. So how do you implement these, given that fishery policies don't happen on a clean slate? Well, obviously, that's going to depend on where these fishery measure policies might be implemented. But if we were to focus just on the US and the national standards of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, there are a number of ways that could introduce some of these measures. So on the one hand, we could look at short-term measures that could be applied through emergency actions. Current rules under NOAA do allow for emergency actions to unforeseen events or newly discovered circumstances. The problem, though, of course, is that with emergency actions, they tend to forego any kind of value of advance notice or public comment, and really not conducive to planning purposes. And so it may be that in the medium term, we might want to consider amending management plans so that they can include adaptive measures if a trigger were to be met. So, for instance, similar to crop insurance that often uses index insurance, where payouts are determined based on crossing a threshold for annual rainfall, for instance, it could be that certain actions kick in if a threshold is triggered. For instance, if a sea surface temperature over an extended period was above a certain level. And again, the challenge here would be making sure that the triggering mechanism is actually reflective of the risk encountered by fishers or fishing communities. In the long run, we could think of maybe more permanent changes to fisheries management in the form of new permit definitions, federal regulations, or just national standards that explicitly incorporate adaptive management as an objective. Next slide, Jim. So just to wrap up, as an economist, I feel obliged to point out that there's no such thing as a free lunch, and that trade-offs and opportunities exist. And, I'm not going to be exhaustive here, but, a few examples would include short-run openings to closed areas, which may be low cost for fishers, but might have a high ecological cost if not monitored. Similarly, for banking and quota borrowing, that could be low cost for the fleet, but if there's not electronic monitoring, observers, or quota management systems, this could be a high cost as well. And at the end of the day, any sort of adaptive capacity measures that are introduced has to consider the structure of the fishery management system. So in the US, this is a pretty prescriptive and often considered rigid system, which has been designed to prevent and curb overfishing. And so any sort of adaptive capacity that might push up against elements that have been successful for sustaining fisheries has to be considered very carefully. There's also political economy implications that need to be considered. Some people who own permits may think of some of these adaptive capacity measures to potentially undermine their incomes and investments. But, I think that in some cases, we might actually say that, yes, that like something like introducing additional permits might undermine the value of a permit. But in some cases, we could think of some of these measures as actually increasing the value of a permit if it reduces year-to-year variation in fishing returns, for instance. And ultimately, any sort of costs have to be interpreted relative to the counterfactual, in which fishery disasters are often addressed through fishery disaster declarations. And if we don't introduce adaptive capacity, it could be that sustaining the status quo isn't a good option either, because of increased shocks to fishing communities and fishers. So next slide, Jim. So just to finish up here, we think that there's a lot of opportunities for managers to introduce measures to improve adaptive capacity, given the current management regime that managers find themselves in. And, ultimately, implementation of any such measures is going to require an understanding of the different combinations of permit definitions and adaptive margins that improve adaptive capacity while still ensuring the sustainability of fish stocks. So I'll end with that. And I know we didn't leave a ton of time for questions, but feel free to ask any questions that you may have, and we'll do our best to answer them.
We'll just give them to Anthony.
Yeah, so if folks we have 5 minutes for questions. If folks want to drop anything in the Q&A, while I give that a minute, you guys gave a lot of options for management. This is obviously a very complicated issue. So I'll put one question to you while we give it a second, which is, if you were taking this research forward, what of those questions do you think you would address? Especially like how do you see research helping to further illuminate these complexities and trade-offs?
I guess I'll start. Matt, you can
I'm
jump
like,
in.
Anthony?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the key point there is we can sit and think about how to tweak or design different ways of introducing adaptive capacity, but there are trade-offs that you have to consider. And to get to that detail, you have to think about the context. You'd want to engage at the beginning the fishing community and the fishers. They're incredibly novel. They have great ideas about how to do things, and it'd be important to incorporate them and thinking about modeling those trade-offs and understanding what the relative magnitudes are and how you can minimize potentially some of the downsides like Matt talked about. If you open up a closed area, sure, that could work great, but that closed area was there for a reason. And so we need to understand, are we jeopardizing that? Are we jeopardizing that for a 20-year period, or is it really just 2 years and then it should sort of bounce back? We have to really think carefully through all that. And the other thing is that, and Matt ended this in sort of the long run, is that if we think about how we've evolved our management, our first steps of management were on that internal margin, right? And it wasn't until the regulated access, limited entry, catch shares that we got the external margin. And those internal margin decisions were made when we had thousands of vessels participating in fisheries. In some of these fisheries, we have 10 now, right? And so I think it's an important question to go back and ask, do we need all those internal margin rules and regulations that we set up in a world with 10 fishers? We needed it back then, and that should be part of that adaptive capacity discussion.
Cool. And
Yeah, just the one thing I would just add to that is case studies. And I think if anything has been highlighted enough in this, and the big thing that stood out to us in this work is just how much context matters. And so in-depth case studies are going to really, really make a difference here for furthering our understanding, and then a comparison across those case studies.
Yeah. We're actually learning that from many of our projects too, that we're funding. We do have a question in the Q&A and then one in the chat. The Q&A one came in first. The Wilson et al. Paper set out the idea of setting standards and let industry determine how to meet them with oversight. Related to your internal margins set standard cannot catch juveniles. Fishers can then use gear, location, time to meet that standard. Do you consider that an aspect of flexibility?
Yes. And in fact, New Zealand does the same thing. They set a TAC and then allow the industry to determine the appropriate gear given the market conditions to harvest that TAC. They're not allocating quota per particular gear like we do in the US. And in lots of places, that's the case. And so, yeah, this example is just it's a more specific example to that same idea.
I would consider this to be more of a bottom-up approach.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's right.
And the last question that we have time for came in the chat, which is super interesting. In 2019, neither offshore wind lease areas nor aquaculture opportunity areas within the Southern California Bight nor 30 by 30 initiatives were on the radar. How do these external forces which will likely result in loss of important fishing grounds, factor into this discussion? And this is a huge question, I want to acknowledge, but if you guys have any thoughts to share about, balancing, multiple uses.
I mean, if anything, it places additional restrictions on the margins that fishery managers have, and in particular, it highlights the fact that these external margins aren't just necessarily across fisheries and between fishery managers, but across different sectors that use the ocean differently. And so I think it just expands the scope and makes it even more challenging.
Monica, did you have anything to add? You looked like maybe you wanted to talk, but you don't have to.
No, I was going to say something similar to Matt, where I think that this emphasized the need to look at the different margins, right? If you're going to have constriction on across one of the margins, then you want to look more at the other three that might still be available to you. So that's all I was going to add.
Cool. And Anthony, you just had your hand up. Did you have anything to add before we?
I wanted to give a thumbs up to what Monica said.
Okay. Okay. Anthony amplifies what Monica said, but we're right at time now. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you so much to Matt and Jim and Monica and Anthony. We're looking forward to continued results coming out of this project. We will share all of it. We will share the recording within a day of this webinar. And thank you for everybody joining today. Thank you so much.
And thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.